Has the Bible been corrupted? This is part 2 of a series, and the title of this message is Saving the Old Testament. Welcome to a closer look where we faithfully examine Bible verses used by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You might be thinking, is this just another one of those anti-Mormon shows? Well, this may surprise you, but Christians think that Mormonism is actually anti-Christian. That might set you back. Why would you say that? Why would you think that Mormonism is anti-Christian? In fact, it says on the side of all of our buildings, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. How could you call it anti-Christian? Well, it does claim to be the one true church, doesn't it? Well, what does that say about all the other churches? It says that all other churches are wrong in Joseph Smith History, chapter 1, verse 19, that our pastors are corrupt, that our doctrines are the teachings and commandments of men, that our Bible has been corrupted. I think it's reasonable for Christians like myself to look at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as anti-Christian. A common response may be, well, we invite you to bring what you have, and then we just want to add to it. That's a common response I hear. But is that really true? Is that really true that you just want us to bring what we have and you'll add to it? Well, can we bring the fundamentals of what we believe? Can we bring the doctrine of the Trinity into the church? Can we bring salvation by grace through faith alone into the church? Can we bring our belief, our sincerely held conviction that there is only one God in the universe, period? Can we bring our conviction of the virgin birth, that Mary was actually a virgin and she didn't have relations with Heavenly Father? Can we really bring our belief that we are born sinners? Can we really believe or bring our belief that the Bible has not been corrupted? So a sincere question I have is that really true? That we should just simply, that you invite us to come and we can bring what we already have and you'll add to it? No, it's not true at all. So my sincere question is, why is it okay for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to attack the Bible, and anytime we may respond to that, to defend the Bible, that it's referred to as anti-Mormon? I'm not going to attack Mormons. In fact, I love Mormons. Will I attack LDS doctrines and beliefs? Well, I guess you could understand it that way, but the reality is we are responding to attacks against us. And this is what this particular series is about, is answering the question, or the attack, has the Bible been corrupted? If you missed part 1 of this series, I encourage you to go back and watch it, because each episode on this series builds on each other. So let's review. The LDS Church has painted a fairly ugly picture of the reliability of the Bible. Some of the parts of the quotes that were in full last episode are from 1 Nephi 13:24 through 29, which says, "Many plain and precious truths have been taken from the book." What book? The Bible. Orson Pratt, one of the early apostles of the LDS Church, said about the Bible that it's been mutilated, it's been changed and corrupted. Who in his right mind for one moment would suppose that the Bible in its present form to be a perfect guide? Joseph Smith himself said this: "Ignorant translators, careless transcribers, or designing and corrupt priests have committed many errors." And then the 8th article of faith, which you're probably familiar with, says, "We believe the Bible as far as it is translated correctly." Well, what is the obvious implication? It's that the Bible has not been translated correctly. So that's what this series is doing, is we are effectively challenging those claims against the Bible, attacks against Christianity, and our belief that this book, the Bible, has been preserved faithfully for us. So what are these lost, plain, and precious truths that have been removed? There's a great article on the church's official website, lds.org, and the article is titled, Plain and Precious Truths Restored. The subtitle is, A Careful Examination of the Book of Mormon Reveals Many Significant Doctrines Not Found in the Bible. So the Book of Mormon restores these truths, or many of them, things that are not found in the Bible because they've been taken out as it's been corrupted and things have been removed. Here's several quotes from that article on lds.org. 1 Nephi 13:40 is quoted, and it says, "But the Lord prepared the Book of Mormon to," quote, "make known plain and precious things which have been taken away." And so he cites 1 Nephi 13:40. It goes on in the article and says, "These precious truths include new insights about biblical people and events, prophecies, visions, and doctrinal principles." The article gives an abbreviated list of these restored truths. Here's just a short list of that is mentioned in the article. Doctrines restored, things about the premortal existence, about Adam's fall and human suffering. It gives details that certainly aren't in the Bible about Adam's fall, that it was a fall up rather than a fall down. It gives details about free agency that aren't in the Bible, about the atonement, about the first principles and ordinances such as church and also church organization. The whole structure of the LDS church that's not found in the Bible has been restored apparently. Things about personal revelation, Satan's identity and methods, and I would personally add stuff about eternal progression, that you can become a god, about eternal families, about temples and the ceremonies that go with that. Those are all truths that have supposedly been taken out of the Bible by these corrupt priests and careless transcribers. The article goes on and says, "We have just scratched the surface. The number of plain and precious truths restored is voluminous." Oh, what a great word. Voluminous. That's your word for the day. You got to use it at least once. But those plain and precious truths are voluminous that have been restored. Goes on in the article and says, "Joseph Smith was the instrument God used to reveal many lost truths once again. To quote, make plain the old paths that if followed would lead one to exaltation and eternal life." At the very end of this article, it gives instructions for when a family sits down, probably in family home evening, to give an illustration to the children about how the Bible has been corrupted and how you need the Book of Mormon and the rest of the church stuff, LDS church stuff, in order to fill in those gaps. So let's look at this slide. This is at the end of that article. Instructions for the family. It says, make a copy for each family member of a simple recipe to make a treat that everyone enjoys. Then make a second copy of the recipe with key ingredients and cooking processes missing. Discuss the differences in the recipes and the problems that arise when essential information is missing. Compare this to what the author shows happened to the scriptures when plain and precious truths were removed. So it's a great object lesson to demonstrate that. So the idea is that the kid would be looking at a recipe with very important details missing. And that child is supposed to make the connection that the Bible is missing so many parts and pieces that without the Book of Mormon and all of the other truths restored by LDS prophets, then you couldn't get the recipe right. It would taste terrible. It would be miserable, and you simply wouldn't get it right. A big question, very big question. Does this scenario match up with physical reality? Does the plethora of archaeological and ancient Bible manuscript evidence show corruption or preservation? Now I'm going to show you a couple of charts. I love charts. Charts are great as teaching tools. In Joseph Smith's day, it was easy, very easy to claim corruption because there was very little historical data to refute it. Take a look at this chart. On the far right, we see the Book of Mormon published, claims of the Bible corruption in 1830 AD. We go all the way back to the far left, where the New Testament was completed around 90-ish AD. Go to the middle top where it says, the oldest Bible manuscripts for the Old and New Testament in Joseph Smith's day was from about 900-ish AD. And the bottom portion of this chart says the early LDS claims was that these changes took place between 460 and 1400 AD, and that comes from the old LDS publication, the Evening and Morning Star, Volume 1, Number 1, June 1832, on page 3. So we have this gap. Very important to recognize that when Joseph Smith was on the scene, the oldest copies of the Old and New Testament were from about 900 AD. So that was about a 1,000-year gap from the time the New Testament was completed to the most recent copies that were available in Joseph Smith's day. So it's very easy to slide in that 1,000-year gap, say that is when these corruptions took place. Very easy to do. Now let's look at this next chart, and things have changed considerably since Joseph Smith's day as far as the manuscript evidence that we have. So on this second chart, look at the information that is in red. The red on the far right says the red information is what we have today in 2018. Go all the way to the left, says the oldest copies, the oldest Old Testament manuscripts are from about 200-ish BC. Go up to the top. The oldest complete New Testament copies we have today are from the 3rd or 5th centuries. Complete, full copies of the New Testament. And then on the bottom it says we have parts and pieces of various size within 25 to 50 years from completion. Very significant. We'll come back to the information on this chart, but super important to realize that we have copies of the Old Testament today from about 200 to 250 BC. So that eliminates that 1,000-year gap. And we have New Testament copies, or parts and pieces, complete from just a few hundred years after it was completed. Then we have partial pieces from within 25 to 50 years. So the question we got to ask is, do these manuscripts we have today show corruption or preservation? Do these old copies we have now that archaeologists have dig up, do we find those lost, plain, and precious truths? We should, because if the corruption happened, as the early LDS Church said, between 460 and 1400 AD, well, the older copies should have those lost, plain, and precious truths. That just simply makes sense. Today, we're just going to look at the Old Testament, half the Bible, 39 books. We're going to save over half of the Bible today. So let's look at this next slide. Some simple bullet point facts. Number one, plain and precious truths were lost after the death of the apostles. That's what it says in 1 Nephi 13, that it went forth in purity out of the hands of the apostles, 1 Nephi 13:25. So when the apostles wrote, or the New Testament writers wrote it, and they gave it out, it went forth in purity, both the Old and the New Testament. So it went out of their hands in purity. So after that is when the corruption took place. Second bullet point, or number two, Copies prior to the apostles' death should contain lost, plain, and precious truths. Very simple. Simple logic makes sense. If corruption happened here on the timeline, then you go before that time period when the corruption took place. These manuscripts should have those lost, plain, and precious truths. Third point, today we have the Dead Sea Scrolls that are written from about 250-ish AD to 68-ish AD, all before the New Testament was completed. And it contains parts of all of the Old Testament books except for Esther, all of them. So, massive question. Do the Dead Sea Scroll, copies of the Old Testament, contain these lost, plain, and precious truths? If the prophecy in the Book of Mormon, 1 Nephi 13, is true, those older copies should contain those lost truths. But do they? If you are LDS, this question should concern you. This isn't anti-Mormon as far as we're not against you. I'm simply responding to attacks against the Bible, that it has been corrupted. I'm defending the Bible, looking at the evidence to see if that claim is true, that corruption has happened. So we're going to look at these copies prior to the death of the apostles and what we have today in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Joseph Smith made his own inspired version of the Bible. It's called the JST, or the Joseph Smith translation. You may have heard of it, you may not have heard of it. Some Latter-day Saints know of it and some don't. But if you have your copy, the church published Bible, the King James Bible, and in the footnotes, every once in a while you'll see JST. Well, that's a reference to the Joseph Smith translation in the footnotes. And I personally think the church doesn't use the Joseph Smith translation for obvious reasons reasons that should become obvious. But I recommend a book for you to buy. It's published by Faithful Latter-day Saints. It's called The Bible Corrected by Joseph Smith. And it's by Kenneth and Lindell Lutz. Sorry if I mispronounced their name. They're, as far as I know, Faithful Latter-day Saints. And they've done a tremendous work, a huge work. It would have taken a lot of time. And what they did is they took the King James Bible and, they didn't rewrite it, but republished parts of it. And where Joseph Smith took out information to make his inspired version, they put a strike-through line through the parts of the King James Bible where he took out those parts. Where he made additions, and sometimes they were very significant additions, it was in bold print. And I really encourage you to get that so you can get a visual in your mind of the changes and additions that Joseph Smith made. I want to look at just two of the very things that I would say very significant changes and additions that Joseph Smith made to make his new translation of the Bible. Genesis 50 in the Joseph Smith translation contains a very lengthy prophecy that's not found in our Bibles today. It's not in the King James Bible or any other modern translation. Genesis 50 contains a lengthy prophecy about the coming of Joseph Smith himself. I personally think that's a very convenient prophecy to have him write in, but it's a very lengthy prophecy added to Genesis chapter 50. So our question is, was that actually a lost, plain, and precious truth? Well, these older copies that we have of the Old Testament from the Dead Sea Scrolls that were written way prior to the death of the apostles when the Bible went out in purity. So we're going to go back in time to see if that prophecy that Joseph Smith added about himself to Genesis 50, is that in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Another significant one I want to look at briefly is Isaiah 29. Now, if you're LDS, if you went on a mission, you've probably used Isaiah 29 to say that this is a prophecy about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, much like you would use Ezekiel 37 and about the sticks and such. Well, that will save the discussion of the interpretation of Isaiah 29 for another episode. But Joseph Smith added a whole bunch of information to make Isaiah 29 abundantly clear that it was a prophecy about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. So here's my question on that. If the corruption happened after the apostles died, these prophecies should be in the more ancient copies that we have today in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It would be the biggest archaeological find ever, which, by the way, the Dead Sea Scrolls was one of the biggest archaeological finds ever, but it would have been something that put the Mormon Church on the map, even bigger on the map. It would have proved that it is true, because the Dead Sea Scrolls would have definitive proof that the additions that Joseph Smith made to the Old Testament were legit. Specifically, this prophecy in Genesis 50 about himself, and this prophecy that he added in Isaiah 29 about the Book of Mormon. So, were they? When you read through the Dead Sea Scrolls, those copies of Isaiah and Genesis, were those prophecies that Joseph Smith added there? No, they were not. They simply were not there. That's significant. That should bother you. If you're claiming that the Bible has been corrupted, which is a great claim, it's a claim that I would say is kind of anti-Christian, but if it's not true, you should abandon this. You should trust the Bible. Abandon this as a prophecy, as a true prophecy from the Book of Mormon. The reality is, the Dead Sea Scrolls faithfully match the Bibles we have today. Faithfully match. And those changes and additions that Joseph Smith made, none of those things are there. Are there variants? Of course. Are there different readings? Of course. These are handwritten copies, but they're not lost, plain, and precious truths. We don't find lost LDS doctrine in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's simply not there. Well, that covers the first 39 books of the Bible in a short version. First Nephi 13:24 through 29 can legitimately, definitively say is a false prophecy. And the prophecy was that after the death of the apostles, or after the apostles leave, well, first and foremost, that the Bible went forth from the apostles' hands in purity, so went forth pure. Then after that, corruption took place. So the prophecy is that it would be corrupted. However, the manuscript evidence that we go before the apostles shows preservation, not corruption. So that is definitive, a false prophecy. Well, what about the New Testament? What about those 27 more books that we have in our Bible? We're just going to touch on the New Testament for this episode, and then we'll build on it for the next 2 episodes. But I want you to remember that quote from Orson Pratt given in the last episode, or the first episode of this. It says, all the most ancient manuscripts of the New Testament known to the world differ from each other in almost every verse. The learned admit that in the manuscripts of the New Testament alone, there are no less than 130,000 different readings. No one can tell whether one verse of either the Old Testament conveys the ideas of the original author. Just think, 130,000 different readings in the New Testament alone. Now turn to the Book of Mormon. That was Orson Pratt, Journal of Discourses, Volume 7, pages 22 through 23. Now, if you are LDS, you would naturally think, because of what you've been taught, that those 130,000 different readings represent evidence of lost, plain, and precious truths. And I think that's what the church wants you to believe. Now, there's a logical fallacy called equivocation. I know it's a big word, but equivocation, here's a definition. The use, or I would say abuse, of ambiguous language to conceal the truth. Now, in that quote from Orson Pratt, he says there's 130,000 different readings. That's somewhat ambiguous language, talking about these different readings, because he doesn't tell you what those readings are. Those different readings are. Do we know what those different readings are? Yes. Are they lost, plain, and precious truths? No. A funny example of equivocation is, did you hear about that Canadian man that was viciously attacked by a polar bear? And the liberal media did nothing to report it at all. Well, sounds gruesome, sounds brutal, sounds tragic, until you hear or see the rest of the story. Take a look at this slide. Wow. So do these 130,000 different readings, which sounds really bad, sounds like a polar bear attacking a man, are they really lost, plain and precious truths? Not even close. It's like the cute little polar bear cub gnawing at the guy's ankle. The church has skillfully used equivocation so that you think those 130,000 different readings are lost, plain and precious truths. Here's the reality check. There's not 130,000 different readings. There's actually more like 400,000 different readings. And well, before you jump into thinking this is a big old polar bear attacking, next episode, the next 2 episodes, we'll look at what those different readings are. And they're so insignificant. Important question. What are those variants? Or questions, important questions. What are those variants? How significant are they? Are they lost truths? Well, you got to watch the next episode to find out. But what's the conclusion for this episode of A Closer Look? Here's another chart for you, that same chart, but with some additional information in blue. So look at that first thing at the top there in blue. The Book of Mormon prophesied Bible corruptions after leaving the apostles' hands. So 1 Nephi 13, 24 through 29. That is the prophecy that after the apostles, after the New Testament, Old Testament left the apostles' hands, it went forth in purity. After that is when corruption took place. Next blue square or rectangle. Lost truths would exist in copies prior to the apostles. This is simple. Simply here's when the apostles let go of the Bible and it went this way. This is when it was supposedly corrupted. If we go back prior to that, we should see those lost truths no longer lost, but in the manuscript record. The Dead Sea Scroll Bible copies do not contain lost LDS doctrine. Therefore, the only conclusion we can come to, logically, is that 1 Nephi 13, 24 through 29, at least talking about the Old Testament at this point, is a false prophecy. Now, this next slide, I encourage you to do much more homework on this. Dig deeper. These few episodes of A Closer Look, when we're talking about this question of has the Bible been corrupted, you can literally get a PhD in this subject. So I encourage you to look at the slide. There's a few things that have for you to do further reading, 2 books, and 1 class you can take on textual criticism. And after you read those things and maybe take that class, if you still believe the Bible has been corrupted, well, I can come to no other conclusion than you're no different than the Pharisees that watched Jesus heal blind people and raise people from the dead and still not believe he was who he said he was. Because the evidence absolutely proves that the Bible has been preserved faithfully. Thank you for watching this episode, and don't ever be afraid to take a closer look.